Hello and welcome to the Growth Workshop podcast with me, Matt Best, and Jonny Adams.
Hello.
And today we're absolutely thrilled to be joined by Athena and Peppes, and you're going to talk to us a lot around navigating AI adoption through overcoming fear and embracing foresight. We're going to address some of those ethical challenges that come up as part of that today. So we're really looking forward to getting into that conversation. So Athena, welcome and thank you for coming along.
Well, pleasure to be here today. Thank you for inviting me.
Brilliant. And just a bit about your background. So you're a futurist speaker and you advise on trends in technology, looking into the future, and also a founder of Athena Peppes Consulting and Beacon Thought Leadership. But I wonder, for the benefit of our audience, if you could just share a little bit about your background and your journey so far.
Yes, absolutely. So I started off my career as an economist, working in insurance, and then in shipping and mining. And my role at the time involved forecasting quite a lot, which is very different to foresight, and researching those sectors and understanding a lot about the policy issues, what the demand supply is in those sectors. Then I moved to Accenture, which is a major consulting and technology company. And I worked in thought leadership there for 15 years, focused on topics related to the future of business.
Wow.
And more recently, as you said, I've founded my own consultancies, helping my clients with two aspects of what I'm really passionate about. One is around long-term thinking and really understanding how technology trends are going to shape business, they're going to change it, and how to help them be prepared and actually turn that change into an opportunity and growth for their organization. And the other is around a consultancy is a partnership focused on helping them with their thought leadership initiatives.
Wow, fantastic. So I was going to try and come up with some sort of pun there, but I think this is all going to be very futuristic. I'm very much looking forward to diving into this with you.
I'm glad that you finished it because I was like, is he going to do it? I'm absolutely super interested about this topic today, Athena, and really, I think in the last number of conferences or what's going on in the news feed on LinkedIn at the moment, it's all about the future and what does technology mean to us? And there's a lot more sort of that personal impact. So I'm really super excited to spend some time with you today. So thank you for joining us.
Perfect. Before we jump into the future, though, what's customary on the Growth Workshop podcast is for us to ask you a little bit about what's been going on in your week. What have you learned? What's been interesting? Maybe something that you've experienced in your personal life that you'd be happy to share with us in the audience today.
Excellent question. I'll draw on my recent trip. I just came back from Dubai, actually, yesterday. I spent 5 days there, visiting different sites there, in Abu Dhabi as well. And I was very impressed. It was my first time there. I was very impressed with the focus they have on long-term thinking and future generations, and how they plan the city and they plan their economy with that in mind and kind of working backwards. So yeah, that was an amazing experience.
Good weather, good food, and good shopping. Is that fair to say?
Those things may have come into it.
What was your favourite out of those three?
The weather, not so much, because I'm Greek, so I should be used to the heat, but it's actually very humid there, and so quite different. Shopping was excellent, I will say. I've never seen a shopping mall like Dubai Mall, for sure.
Did you go out on the plane with a half-empty suitcase and come back with a full suitcase on the way back?
I definitely left it off space.
Good on you.
Fantastic, brilliant. Well, I mean, thank you for sharing that, Athena. And actually, when we dive into the conversation today, I imagine some of that reflection from your trip to Dubai and sort of that forward-thinking mindset will come out of it. So, Jonny, how about you?
This week's been amazing. So, I mean, it's great to have Athena here. She's worked and is a thought leader herself, and one of my favourite authors, Steve Martin. Some of you may have read some of his books in the past. Authors a lot of information insights around influence and persuasion. I went to his latest book launch. He's just collaborated with The Economist. And Matt, you and I have been lucky, but also maybe, showed how our business works, is that we've worked with his organisation for the last 5 years. They are behavioural scientists. They are an organisation called Influence at Work. And us at SBR, from a business development perspective, have sort of merged together to bring science and art together. And for the last 5 years, we've worked with him. And I think some of the tips and techniques that he writes about in Influence and Persuasion have really helped me as an individual become better at my job and as a person. So he talks a lot about the 6 principles of influence and persuasion, and if you haven't looked at that or listened, and he's got some great insights around that topic. So yeah, went to the book launch, really good, had a beer, it was fantastic. What about you?
Nice. So I went to a slightly different event actually, and it was an engaged sales event recently in London, which talked about it was focused on marketing and sales, and a lot of what we talk about on the Growth Workshop podcast is, of course, around kind of client centricity and that focus on bringing that all together in organizations. And there was a lot of discussion at that event actually, which was really insightful. So similar, came out with some I feel like I've learned a lot this week, which is always a good place to be.
What was the one thing that you took away that was like, yeah, that was good? What was the
You know what, there was one of the speakers was talking about the importance of, when it comes to sales and marketing enablement, the importance of creating a community around it, acknowledging that normally those teams are quite small. So the ability to scale is challenged, right? So yes, it's scaling through enabling leaders, but also creating a community of people to support getting that out into the market. So selecting individuals from different teams to be sort of champions and change carriers, which I think is really, really important to maximize the impact of that. So that was probably one of my takeaways. So Athena, as we look to the future, again, I'm going to try not to say that too many times. But one of the we're enjoying it. We were reading in one of your blogs recently, which is actually titled "Could Humanoid Robots Close the Gender Equality Gap?" And in that book, on that blog rather, you talk about the process of adopting technology and how it involves overcoming some of those natural, understandable and justified concerns, right? But our challenge as humans is not to avoid this progress, but to make productive, informed and moral use of it. So certainly whenever I think about the sort of evolution of AI and look around at some of the people sat in those C-suite jobs, right? You can sense some fear in that. What do you do, and how do you help those leaders in getting comfortable with that and being able to make informed decisions around how to effectively and appropriately leverage these technologies?
Yeah, that's a very good question. There's a lot to unpack there. You mentioned the word fear, for example. I think perhaps there is a little bit of fear, but actually the main concern is around those leaders being fully prepared, especially in an environment where this technology is just changing so fast. And, I think we're currently in a technology or innovation super cycle. So one development you see in artificial intelligence is quickly bringing in another. And that's how I ended up writing the article around humanoid robotics, because there's a lot of emphasis in the AI research community at the moment in terms of how large language models and generative AI can be embedded into the previous generation of robotics, and that can bring about another wave of growth. So, that's all happened quite fast, and it's only been a couple of years since ChatGPT was released. But actually the field of AI, the research that's been done around that has been going on for much longer. Since the release of ChatGPT, there's been a lot of hype, a lot of media attention on it, a lot of company investment. So all of that can make leaders feel like things are changing really fast. What am I doing? Everyone's doing this. What do I do? The reality is that if you kind of look at, I was thinking about this the other day, because in the last 6 months, I think I've had more than 200 conversations with different organizations. And the topic that always comes up is artificial intelligence in terms of what's top of mind for those companies. But the pace of adoption is very, very different, right? And that makes sense because if you are in consumer goods, you will just naturally move a lot faster and adopt and respond to trends a lot faster. But some industries like pharmaceuticals are a lot more heavily regulated. So you'd understand that they might be a bit more hesitant or slow, reluctant, and want to be a bit more prepared before adopting a new technology. There's also the dimension of size. I personally have seen that a lot of the narrative that we get around technology trends, including AI, shaped by very large technology companies, right? But as I just mentioned, the industry makes a difference. The size makes a difference of an organization. In the UK, if you look at the data, 99% of companies are actually SMEs. If you look at that by revenues, it's about 50%, employees 60%. So they're the backbone of the economy, right? And so it can feel like everyone's ahead of you in AI. There is a lot of fear, lack of confidence. How do I go about this? Surely everyone knows what they're doing. And actually, that's not the reality, because if you go a bit deeper, you'll see there's a lot of variation in terms of adoption.
I feel like I'm butting in, but there's a piece that I think was really interesting. I know you're going to continue on this trend of asking the question, is that you reference, you've had many conversations, and we also do. Like we did some market analysis where there isn't really a growth consultancy in the space that's taking and capitalizing on this AI conversation through our market analysis in the last few months. We better find a way of getting that. But what I mean by that, Athena, is that could you give like a summary, and without putting you on the spot too much, what are those common questions that you're getting asked about, or common concerns maybe? So why I ask that question is I think the listeners that are typically the individuals that you're talking to might go, yeah, I also have got those problems or questions. Do you have a trend of what they're asking you at the moment?
It's a little bit varied, I would say. And that's why I mentioned kind of the industry and size of company. I won't mention names. I'll just give you a couple of examples as illustrations. So, for example, I was talking to a marketing agency that works a lot with life sciences and pharmaceutical companies. And they were the ones that were saying, look, we see the potential to use AI in what we do, but it's very important to take our clients along with us in that journey. And they're a little bit hesitant because they worry about that regulation. And when you say AI, that could mean a lot of different things. It could be something very simple, right? Yeah. It can be something super sophisticated.
It should be AI for dummies. You remember the book that we all bought? I think my mum and dad got how do you use a computer for dummies? Now it's like, hey, there must be one.
I'm sure there is, but it's a little bit like that. And I think the issue is sometimes if you're a very senior executive or, then it can feel a little bit like, oh, I can't say that I don't know exactly what's happening in that space. And actually the best way to kind of get around any fears, just better understanding, better knowledge, more conversation around the topic. Another example is how to use it for pricing, how to use AI for pricing.
Just describe that a little bit more, because I'm curious. This week I've talked to a professional service firm. So future will look like there's been a lot of consolidation in financial services over the last number of years. There's going to be a heavy pivot towards professional services being consolidating in the UK market, with a lot of classic sort of money needing to be invested by investors, as we all know what's going on at the moment. And that was sort of a bit of insight shared to me this week. But pricing was the key point that investors are looking for at the moment. So how do you think AI and pricing, I'm curious about that because that's very topical.
Yeah.
Where did that come from?
So that came from another kind of lead, and they're just interested in understanding basically how they can get better data faster into their sales teams using it, and how AI can help them do that so that they can have more competitive pricing, so they can think a little bit differently about what their pricing strategy might be, so they can,
board of some type,
or modeling different scenarios, right? And being able to understand, okay, if I do this, what if this happens, what would the impact be? And some of that might be already there, but obviously it's becoming a lot more sophisticated. The data sets on which these models are trained are a lot bigger. So in theory, they should be better quality, but then you also get issues around that. Like, is it really that robust? We know there's an issue with hallucinations, right? So if you create a tool to help your teams with pricing, how can you make sure that the data it gives them is also very robust? You're also dealing with very sensitive data, right? How do you ensure that it's secure when it comes to pricing? So those are some of the questions that are coming up around this.
So something that's sort of interesting, and I'd love your perspective on some of those industry type trends. You mentioned sort of life sciences and pharmaceutical. Fair to assume that they're a kind of fairly highly regulated industry. I think some of the more, I consider it kind of more straightforward sort of AI technologies are still struggling to get into some of these industries just as a result of the regulatory environment. Do you see this as much the job of regulators and policymakers as it is the businesses themselves?
You mean the job to help with adoption, or to kind of
you sure can't open the floodgates, but if I just think about, say, a piece of sales technology that's focused on just simply recording calls and writing calls, we've worked with a couple of partners that would do that, and getting that kind of technology into some sort of financial institutions is incredibly difficult, because you've got to go through all of the all of these jumping through what feels like, well, jumping through is probably the wrong word, but kind of wading through quicksand or wading through mud to try and get to the end goal. And that feels like that's held back by the regulation and by the policy makers as opposed to the businesses themselves.
Yeah, I think there is an element of that, in the sense that sometimes organizations might wait to see what the regulation is before they adopt something, right? I think then culture comes into play, and kind of how fast you can be. Some organizations might say, well, but in the meantime, we're still missing out on all this potential, all this growth. I think the other thing with being an early adopter is potentially, of course, it's high risk, but also you might be able to illustrate the benefits to the policymakers as well as they shape that policy. The key thing I think around regulation and policy making is that, for sure, organizations have to deal with just a patchwork of regulation, because each country or each region, say in the case of the EU, takes a very different approach.
Yeah.
And then that's another part of the dynamic you have to think about, that, in the US, they tend to be a bit more relaxed. I would argue, if you look at the trend over time, that they are actually becoming a lot more focused on regulation, for sure. But look at the EU AI Act that's already come into force in August, right? And that is quite intense. I'm not an expert in the space, so I can't comment specifically, but I was on a webinar recently about like how many assessments now companies have to do. Because even if you have the same tool, every time you use it, if you use it for sales, you have to do a different assessment than if you use the same tool for marketing or internal employee training or different kind of things. So there is a lot of that, but I think then it comes back to the balance we talked about a little bit before, right?
Yeah.
How do you make sure you take advantage of the opportunity and not miss out?
Yeah. And if we think about kind of practically diving into some of the practicalities of the work that you do, when you sit down with a C-suite executive who feels maybe a little bit underqualified, is getting pressure from the business to adopt new technology, is worried about the risk, and whether that be because risk is always on the other side of that, the other side of that equation. What's your approach typically to doing that? You mentioned sort of education and building an understanding is so important. So is that at the heart of what you do in terms of helping these executives in understanding what this looks like and how it could shape the future of their business?
Yes, in terms of how to help them, it really depends on where they are on that adoption journey. Because some come and say, we we know this is a trend. We know we need to do something. We kind of don't know what to do. Others are experimenting. They've already rolled out some proofs of concept, and just are thinking about scaling, across different business functions. The way I help them is to think a little bit about the future of their organization and where is it that they want to be, and to also make sure that when they're thinking about those technologies, they're not just thinking about today, but what will AI look like in 5 years' time, so that you can be, whatever you introduce now can be more resilient. So that's kind of behind the thinking. I would always start with the problem. So what's the problem that they're facing, right? It's the classic consulting of trying to understand. In some cases, it's not them, it's their teams. How do we take our teams along with us? In other cases, it's like, oh, we feel resistance because people think this is going to take over their jobs. How can we make them sure there's actually potential to help their jobs? It kind of varies a lot.
And if you're looking, and again, I kind of digging into this, and I'm really curious as your perspective. We talk a lot when we're working with leaders around kind of toward and away motivation of your employees, right? So away motivation being, I'm afraid of something, so I'm going to do something because of the consequences of something else. And toward motivation is I'm going to do something because I really want to strive for it. So it's sort of proactive versus carrot versus stick, if you like. Are you seeing that if you had to sort of balance the equation, on which side is that falling? Is it more about, with the executives that you work with in the businesses you work with, is it fear of being left behind more than what opportunity could we unlock, or is it the other way around?
I think it's almost actually a little bit above that, in the sense of, maybe I'll give you a stat and that might help. So some of the research that I've done in the past has been focused on change, quantifying change, the pace of change, and understanding how the C-suite sees that and how that compares to actual data on change on the ground. Now, 88% of C-suite executives surveyed said that they expect the pace of change to accelerate. Okay. But 52% said they're not fully prepared for what that change will mean for their organization.
Wow. So there it is, right?
So, because, as I said, that, and then you can go deeper into that, but the implications are huge, right? Because they have to make decisions about how to allocate their budgets, their time, the people. So if you're not fully prepared, then how are you going to make those decisions? And the idea is that most of the time they spend dealing with the day-to-day operational delivery for the next quarter, financial results, that kind of thing. So how can you, or in this case me, help them kind of take some time out of the day-to-day and think about their organization in the future and where they want to go? And there's different ways to do that, right? You can help them with recognizing the trends that are out there. I always use RISE in my mind as a way to kind of structure that. So like eyes for recognizing trends and just understanding what signals are out there, what's happening. The eyes around imagining the possibilities. Okay. So yes, I've read about this interesting trend, but what does that mean? And so to the example of the humanoid robotics, I was just thinking that who knows whether in the future we might have companies, instead of giving you certain types of benefits like health insurance, what if they gave you a home robot to do all your housework for you, so you wouldn't have to spend your time doing that and you could be more productive?
Oh gosh, I hope the camera caught my face, because it was like, oh, please. That sounds amazing.
But I'm not, the point is not to predict or to argue for it. It is just to say, what if?
Yeah.
Or what, and to pose those kind of questions that really stretch your thinking.
And is that the eye? Because it's unpacking that sort of quite boxed view, and actually we're opening up our blind spots to think, well, what could,
yes, imagine different possibilities, right? Then the S is for shape scenarios, because You can imagine those kind of possibilities, but people respond differently to seeing a story of what their organization will actually look like. So you can take, say, 2 dimensions. If we take the example of AI, you can take a dimension around advancement of the technology, and another one around regulate, fast to slow, and another one around regulation, lenient to kind of tight, and then almost create stories of. So you can imagine like a little quadrant of that, and think about stories of what would that world look like, and how do you operate? What does your organization look like in that future? And then that's where the E comes in around enabling action, because once you have those different stories, what you can do is say, but hold on a second, if that came to bear, that would mean we're obsolete. Or if that came to bear, that would mean we'll make a lot more money. How can we influence that? You know, so that's the idea behind using foresight frameworks to help you think about the future, but see growth today.
Yeah, I think that's such a great. I think anyone, like you talk about that with execs, you can imagine the calmness that comes over the boardroom when they all go, "Oh, okay, so we can put this into those moments, and I can think about this in the big picture without feeling all of that pressure, and I can be, I can be conscious of those other stages." So I love that. I think that's really, and I think actually for anyone listening to this, regardless of where you sit in your own or in your own organization, is a really important way of kind of having that perspective. Because you mentioned the robot in your house doing the cleaning, and like some people will be going to
the will have a robot in the house just yet.
but
I wish.
But some people will be going to the kind of iRobot view, right?
Yeah,
Film with Will Smith. They go, "Oh my gosh, it's going to like destroy us."
Or Black Mirror.
Yeah. Oh my God, let's not go there.
Which is very forward-looking and excellent at predicting
That's
things.
somewhat worrying. But then the reality is that we take ourselves back he came back 20, 30 years and said autonomous cars, everyone would be having exactly the same response that people are probably having now to the idea of having a robot doing the cleaning. I mean, you can almost have a robot doing the cleaning in your house already with the robot Hoover vacuums. I shouldn't say Hoover. The robot vacuums, the robot mops, right? So I think it's just sort of, I guess, being able to sort of see that and put that in perspective is really important.
Well, and also to let you know that already actually exists. So I'll send you a video, which I'm sure you'd love to watch. There's a company called 1X, and a couple of weeks ago they released a humanoid robot called Neo, and the video is of this. I don't know. Would I say he, she? I don't know.
It's Neo.
Helping this person get ready for work, right? I mean, it's kind of fascinating, and there's a lot of VC funding and investment, and even the big tech players like Nvidia are really backing a lot of companies in this space. So it feels futuristic, and part of the job, or my job, is to help organizations see that perhaps it's not as out there as you might think. Some of that is already there. Yes, you could argue about the pace of it, whether people will want to adopt it or not. At the end of the day, technology is not neutral, right? It's up to us to decide if we would want a robot around our children, for example. On the other hand, if I was to put my economist hat on, I would argue it might be a good thing, because we have aging demographic, aging population in many developed countries. How do we care for them when there's a lack of carers? Should policymakers be investing in this? Should companies be working with them to help address this problem? There's just so much to unpack there.
I was going to say, ethics is such a huge topic that exists around this, right? And that, you mentioned it earlier with is it going to take away people's jobs? Is it going to, various other things as well? Right, there's already questions. You mentioned the new regulation around AI, like questions over the ethics that sit behind that. Putting out videos that have got people's faces when they weren't actually there, representing something that they wouldn't necessarily believe in or support. Is that what's your perspective and take on that? Is that an area that you're seeing? Is that becoming kind of heightened problem? Is that surely it's going to slow us down a little bit, but what are you seeing in the market around that ethics challenge?
Yeah. I'd say it's a huge issue, as you say, and there's like so much to think about. I think it can also feel, my thing is always how to simplify stuff, right? And because it can feel like, where do I start? I always have in my mind kind of 5 things to structure a conversation around this and to help think through different issues. The first is around accountability. Who is accountable for the information that your AI-enabled bot gives? Now, this might seem like a straightforward question, but there was an interesting case earlier in the year of Air Canada that basically argued that the bot, which had given mistaken information to one of the customers that was trying to get information around bereavement fees, they argued that the bot was responsible and they had no liability to pay the money back.
Wow.
Now, that did not go down well.
No.
But, that was their kind of argument. But there's all sorts of kind of legal implications around that. And
do you know the outcome of the case? Did they get laughed out of court?
Yes, they did. Yeah.
A bit more human.
Yeah, exactly. They did. But then you can get into a little bit more detailed questions of like, well, is it the executives that kind of approved that? Is there any responsibility with the team that designed it? What about if it was supplied from a third party? So there's like so much complexity there, right? That for companies to figure out. The second one's around bias. So I use these tools quite a lot because I personally think they help my productivity immensely. They save me so much time.
Yeah.
And I just love experimenting with different things. But this is the importance of critical thinking always is I can see that they're biased, and I'm sure they're getting better, or at least I hope. But I was writing a piece around the economics of AI, and I wanted an image of an economist pondering the future of productivity.
So where did you go to find the image? That's the question.
DALL-E. I used DALL-E, but straight away it gave me a man with white hair, obviously, like middle-aged white man. I was like, okay. And then because I've had this experience before, I just thought, I wonder what would happen if I swapped the profession. So you can prompt it to try and get different things and say, oh, give me more diverse and everything. But I was like, what if I just swapped the word economist for nurse? And straight away it gave me a woman. Yeah.
Okay.
So of course they are, because they're trained on information that we've created, and we all come with our own biases. But how do we have a responsibility as an organization to not perpetuate those biases as well if you're using those tools? Then there's the data privacy issues that we've touched on as well. How do you get around that? Deep fakes, that's the fourth one. And I think that's something that's particularly concerning because there's so much synthetic media at the moment and the quality of it is amazing. One that might interest you is, have you seen the Google LM tool that now creates podcasts from articles?
No.
I heard about that.
But
I'd heard about
there we go.
But that's not to say that it all will be, but that also makes you think about your own job. How can you use it to do your job differently, perhaps? Or perhaps as humans, we value the fact that we all got together here and had this conversation in person. We put a greater value on this than on something that was just artificially generated. And then the fifth one is around jobs. And I think that's a huge one because it sometimes gets not mentioned very much in the light of like productivity benefits, which there are many. But I think it's better not to hide away from the conversation and to think about what will that mean for the impact on your people? Will that mean job losses? And if it does, how do you handle that? What's your responsibility to upskill your people and help them understand the technology better?
Could go on that point, and again, I love this conversation. By the way, I'm like nodding. It's just phenomenal. I was curious about that last point, and I suppose it's really hot topic for anyone involved in a growth role, whether that's marketing, sales, consultancy, whatever that may be, customer success. And when you think about that job piece, if you not naming names, if you think about a CEO. The last sort of 10 years in software as a service has been growth at all costs. So they would pretty much do anything to get to where they need to get to, especially if they're VC backed. It's like quite aggressive. Do you think that a CEO and those types of C-suite actually will continue to think about growth at all costs at the absence of job losses at maybe sort of, may I say, middle to lower tier? Or do you think that actually there's going to be some of that ethical sort of input where actually, come on guys, that you've got to not worry too much about growth, and actually you've got to think about the society and the people within your function? Do you have a theme or a trend that people are talking about? Or maybe it's a bit too early, I'm not too sure. But have you got a perspective on that?
Yeah, it's quite diverse, I would say. I think you're right that if we look to the past, to say, for instance, when smartphones and social media kind of became commonplace, there was a lot of issues around, maybe not necessarily on jobs, but kind of parallel issues that we could learn from. And what we saw is that we were very slow, our institutions were very slow to adopt to those kind of issues and help people. Automation would be one example of that, right? Loads of jobs got automated. I think now there's a lot, the kind of jobs that will be affected are not just manual jobs, but also manual routine jobs, but also knowledge workers. And perhaps that's why we are seeing much more of a discussion, because there's a feeling that, this is becoming a lot bigger in terms of the impact on jobs. I don't know if you can generalize about how CEOs are seeing this. I think the CEO of Klarna, the payments company, said that they got rid of 1,200 jobs because generative AI was helping their marketing and sales teams do things so much faster. And he said actually that they'll only be able to function with 2,000 people, I think, as opposed to perhaps nearly double that now or something like that. But there's always the economic incentive of, I think there's an IPO coming up, and
yes, of course.
So there's issues like that. But then
is it a language pattern that creates fear in the current sort of market of job employment, where job cuts, or is it are people being redeployed well enough? It has to come in one hand. That I get the efficiency model, because I'm trying to sit there if I was a CEO and think, well, I've got the pressure of the board, I've got the pressure of investors. Do you know what? I'm 5 years away from exiting, going to retire. Would I go for it? Would I cut headcount and use some type of really, because that's what everyone's telling me, is that AI is going to solve my efficiency problems. I don't know. I've been noodling on that one, and I guess that I don't know which way people would turn. Have you got a thought?
I think it's really challenging. It depends on your perspective. Well, obviously it depends on your perspective. Like I sort of gear towards this view of, because there's a point at which AI is already, I'm picking on AI, there are obviously other, but AI is already helping in finding efficiencies that makes people more productive, that can result in more growth. But I think to your point is, well, that growth at all cost, where does that sort of kick in and start to become a problem? Or where does it become are we just going to find this natural equilibrium, and it just becomes hey, look, there's going to be a sort of reassignment? I think my biggest concern is the pace. So with other transformational changes we think about in other industries in the past, you sort of automation in manufacturing, for example, like that was probably sort of slower, maybe more expensive than, say, AI could be, where it's everything's in the palm of your hand much, much faster. That means an organization could tomorrow say, we're going to, the example that you shared there, Athena, that, we can cut 2,000 jobs kind of almost overnight. And I think it's the pace of that might be the thing that hurts us, because behind all of that, you've got the knock-on effect to education and to the journey that the next generations are going on, and the enabler of, okay, well, we're making sure that we're training them the right thing. How much is AI prevalent in education in schools at the moment, or is it just being left down to to kids just learning through the way that they learn. And I think that's probably the bit that concerns me slightly, is the pace is probably different to, say, previous transformations.
Yeah, and I think, the things you touched on as well about the broader perspective, right? So it helps to think of this from a macroeconomic perspective. CEOs, I think, would generally think about it in the context of their organization, but the issues that come up, like you mentioned, around education, the future, and how do we plan for our economies, those are much bigger issues. And it's not as commonplace to find CEOs that might have that vision. Arguably, some of that might come from us, right? What expectations do we have from these organizations about their responsibility to actually create jobs? So in the economics field, there's a huge debate around the impact of this on jobs. I'm not sure there's a conclusion yet. There's a bigger argument because most of the ways that they would estimate what the impact would be is based on previous waves of change.
Yeah.
And perhaps the data there is not good enough predictor of what's coming in the future. So
it's like you need an AI model to just work.
Exactly. But you see the kind of challenge with doing that. There might be new jobs being created, right? There definitely will be. There are loads of philosophers now being hired by big companies to help them think through these kind of questions that might come up. So it's a huge topic. I just feel that as individuals, the more we understand the technology, the more we use it, the more we learn about it, the more prepared you are to influence that change as well, whether as a consumer, as an employee, as a citizen as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's connecting those things, isn't it? And I think that's going to be the challenge. And we're in danger of kind of diving into something really kind of political. But if I look at the corporation's response to, climate action planning and that kind of thing, it's not been all that proactive, right? It's very much, okay, I'm forced to now do this. And I guess the concern I maybe have, this my personal opinion, is that if we have that same approach to some of this some of the kind of technology and it's not supported, and that's why I asked the question around kind of policymakers and their role in this. And I think there's a really important part to play there.
No, absolutely. And again, they have the same actual trade-off that the C-suite executives have, right? Because arguably there's a huge case to be made for how you use AI in the public sector, which definitely needs improvements in terms of efficiency and services that need to be provided to people. So the opportunity there is huge. But then how do you kind of balance that with what it means for jobs? And arguably they have double the role to play, in a sense of both balancing that as the public sector, but also in terms of the policymakers within that doing, thinking about that for the whole economy.
So the whole conversation has been phenomenal, and the comfort that you're providing me about this topic of technology and AI has been super helpful. I mean, the framework that you've provided, Rise, I'm taking it. I'm keeping it. Thank you. The interesting part is that I feel, and part of our market research recently, Matt, has been about, there isn't a growth consultancy in AI, and we should really be thinking about moving into that. You're clearly a thought leader in the space with some great articles that you've shared. But other than what's being spoken about now in the current marketplace and what we should be talking about and probably dealing with more, what's the next thing after what's being spoken about at the moment? What's the future from there?
For one thing, I think the whole topic of artificial intelligence definitely has more room. There's a lot of discussion around this being hype and so on. And of course, there's always a little bit of hype when something new comes into the forefront, right? So there is. But as you pointed out, the opportunity is definitely there. It's huge. You see some companies appointing chief AI officers into the C-suite board. So in the same way that in the past, if we look at the topic of sustainability, used to be one person doing what was called CSR back then that no one used to take seriously, to now someone, whole teams focusing on how organizations can deliver on those goals. So something similar is happening with AI. I think what people worry about a lot, individuals, is this idea of general artificial intelligence. So this technology being able to completely replicate what we are as humans, but there's just so much that needs to happen for us to get there, that there's, I think we won't be around ourselves to discuss that question,
right.
possibly.
So I don't need to fear anything. I can feel quite confident that we're going to be okay.
Yeah, but I think it's kind of find that balance as an individual, as a leader, as a team member, whoever you might be, whatever role or hat you might be wearing. Find that balance between what's next is finding that balance between making the most of the growth opportunity that is definitely there. Right? The stuff that these technologies can do, they can just create new content in seconds. We know this.
Yeah.
But how can you make sure that you do that in a way that's forward thinking enough that you don't get caught out by some of the risks or challenges or other issues around that? So
I think that's a fantastic place to a fantastic kind of final thought, Athena. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think we had a couple of other conversations recently on the podcast about the importance of that patience, and it feels that we actually need to be a bit patient. We might even need to kind of slow down that decision-making process and be a bit more considered perhaps, but also with that North Star goal of, right, well, what could this do to us to help maximize growth for us personally and also for our businesses?
Yeah, I mean, I think I take your last point. I'm going to capture the opportunity, and thank you for sharing.
Seize the day.
Yeah, I am. I'm a bit more calm in the
Yeah.
circumstances. So thank you so much for sharing some great insights today. Really.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Athena.